Welcome back to the channel, everybody. Today we are working on a car that has not been on the channel very much before, and that is my 1988 Volkswagen Jetta. This car has sat on jack stands with the transmission pulled out of it for probably 2.5 years now. A little bit about this car. I bought this car back in January of 2018 for a really cheap price, and it needed a lot of work when I bought it. It's a factory power windows, factory AC car, but it is not a GLI trim spec, so it's a bit of an oddball. And if you know Mark IIs, this has small bumpers and big doors, which makes it a little bit weird as well. But while you may think that today I would be working on getting the transmission back into the car, I'm actually going to be working on fitting center caps in these wheels. So these are my BBS RMs that my friend Ryan with Red Lion Coatings powder coated for me. He did this awesome teal color. I believe it's a Columbia Powders Bora Bora Blue, I think is the color name. But he did that probably about 2 years ago now. We did the transmission case the same color, and that's part of why I haven't rebuilt that yet. But I split these apart, bought new lips to widen them from Germany. Rebuilt them in my garage and resealed them, so they have now been sitting on the car while the car is on jack stands for probably 1.5 years, built just like this. So I'm going to finally put the center caps back on this, and I've actually already test fitted these, and there's a problem with them, but I'm going to get into that later. So first things first, let's walk over to the workbench and look at the center caps that I have to put on these. So this is the factory center cap. Obviously the trim ring has been powder coated to match the wheels, but the factory center cap is a plastic part that clips, the trim ring clips to it, and then this is a plastic nut, and then this whole assembly clips into the center of the wheel. Now the problem with this is, obviously with plastic, I could probably pay some company to make this look like chrome, but it'll probably end up flaking. So what we ended up buying to replace that entire assembly is these. Despite the URL on the box saying center lock, these are not center locks. These hex caps that I'm about to show you are made by MG Line in Poland, and they are CNC machined and then polished. MG Line makes several different kits for several different wheel manufacturers, including OZ, BBS obviously, and Rotiform. Go check out their website at bbscenterlock.com, and I'll put the link in the description below as well so you guys can navigate to that. And just to be clear, they don't actually make center locks. They make several different center cap kits that give the appearance that your wheels have center locks. And if you go on their website and don't see a kit for your specific wheels, they may potentially custom make a kit for you. So reach out to them via email if you're interested in something. Shipping these from Poland to the States was also fairly fast and only took a couple of weeks. The other interesting thing about these caps is that they are threaded different directions depending on what side of the car they're supposed to be installed on. So the driver's side is left-hand threaded and the passenger side is right-hand threaded. And the instructions call this out as well. You may notice the L and R on the boxes with the different arrow directions to identify that as well. Potentially over-engineered in my opinion, but at the same time, I'd rather be safe than sorry. I don't really want to watch a center cap go passing me on the highway one day. Included in the box is obviously the center caps themselves with the threaded rings, instructions for installation, the 2 Allen keys that you'll need for the installation, and also an air freshener. So the way that these work is this threaded ring gets installed into the center hub portion of the wheel, and then set screwed in 3 places. And that's what holds this in. And then this portion, similar to like a BBS RS cap, will then thread into the collar, and that is how you have center caps. The other provision that is a part of these is the way the trim rings go on. These guys, they just have 2 little Allen or button head screws with plastic washers underneath them, so that this would get held on like that. So what I'm going to go do is put all of these together first. That way they're done. And also, the original caps had black and silver caps in them. I'm going to keep these, but I'm not going to reuse them. What I ended up buying is white and gold caps to kind of play off the gold bolts that I put with the polished lips. So we're going to install all of these, put all the trim rings on, and then we will go to the next step of putting these in a couple wheels and show you guys how that goes. First step for assembling these is putting these fresh BBS center caps into the hexes, and these just snap in. If I was thinking about it ahead of time though, I would have put these parts in the house for a couple days to warm them up. That way the plastic was a little bit more forgiving and the aluminum would have expanded slightly. But after a good amount of pressure, they snapped in, and then we can move on to bolting the trim ring on. That just takes removing those 2 button heads from the back side of the hexes and then sandwiching the trim ring on. Now, these parts particularly have been powder coated, and the particular color that they've been coated as well is a multi-coat color, so the trim rings are a little thicker than if they were the factory finish. So there's a little slop in the bolts that I play around with to get the trim rings as close to centered as possible. It's probably only a 30 to 50 thousandths gap, but I'm too anal when it comes to things like that and want it to be perfect. Then it should just be rinse and repeat for the next 3, but that's when I realized something. After fighting with getting the plastic wrap off, I realized that somehow 2 of my hexes are missing those button head fasteners and the plastic washers, so I couldn't build all of these ahead of time like I wanted to. For today, I'm only working on the passenger side of the car though, so I just built those 2, and I'll worry about getting more screws later. I don't know if they were missing in the package or if I've lost them over time, because I've had this center cap kit sitting around in the garage for over a year now waiting to install it. But after finding 2 more screws and building another center cap, we're in business and ready to move on to the next part of this, which is putting the threaded collars into the wheels. These collars install into the hub bores with 3 set screws, and it's not a hard thing to install. It's just a little tedious, and you need to be mindful to details, because if you tighten one set screw too much, it pushes the collar to be on an angle, and then the center caps won't sit flush to the wheel. So I take my time and try to keep going around in a circle to evenly tighten the collars in, and I keep feeling around the edge of the collar to see if one side feels higher than the other, which of course it does, so I loosen it a bit and start over with trying to creep up on these being fully tightened. I feel like there's a way to be faster with this if you take your time at the beginning and start with all the set screws at the same relative depth, and then you would rotate the set screws the same amount as you go around, but I didn't do that. After a little bit, I got the collar on the wheel properly, and then it's time for the same process for the other wheels. Then after I've installed all those, we can move on to putting the wheels back on the car, and we can see what these caps look like all mounted up. So now with the wheels back on the car, it's time to see how these bad boys look. Front, perfect. Rears, this is where the issue comes in that I talked about at the beginning of this video. And that's as far as they make it. Not good. Not good at all. So, here's why these center caps don't tighten anymore. So if I take these back out, you'll notice that that cap here, that is the grease cap for the wheel bearings on these cars. This ID, the inside of this, is so thick that it does not make it past that. And that's why it almost tightens all the way down, but it's like an 1/8 to 3/16 of an inch of a gap. So Volkswagen used this rear wheel bearing design from the inception of water-cooled cars, probably even the Beetles. But, you know, if we go from the start of water-cooled, which is, what, 1974-ish, then they used this design all the way up to 1999. So, the two options to get these guys to fit was either run without that, which I really didn't like the idea of, because then you're burning up wheel bearings because they're not greased as well as they should be, or to find a different wheel bearing design. And did some research and found out that Polos in Europe, which are 4x100 cars, came with rear wheel bearings that are similar to USA Mark IVs, but they still retain 4x100. And that was the huge thing with this is, you know, I could go to 5x100 and put Mark IV stub axles on and Mark IV wheel bearings and be fine, but I'm not changing these wheels. The entire point of this is to fit these wheels. So let's go back over to the workbench and I will show you the parts that should hopefully fix this. I haven't done this yet, doing this live, so hopefully the center caps fit when I put these parts on, but we're gonna find out. So here's all the parts that we have to put on the Jetta. So these are the appropriate stub axles that mount to the rear beam to fit those bearings. These are very, very, very hard to get. This combination of parts only came on like very high trim level Polos, like Polo GTIs. And for reference, this is like the early 2000s Polos, which I think are 2001 to 2004. Not 100% sure because, you know, we don't have Polos in the US, so I don't know everything about Polos. But these came from Epitech, which a lot of people know of. They make a lot of trick brake caliper adapters and a whole bunch of other parts. But Epitech does not ship or sell parts to North America. So getting these in the US was very, very difficult, and you pretty much have to know someone who knows someone to be able to get them. So thankfully I had a family friend that was able to ship these to me. And then all the rest of the parts, wheel bearings, brake discs, and fresh dust shields came from eBay. Usually eBay Germany, but you know, of course, we didn't get these cars in the US, so getting these parts is not easy. So went with FAG wheel bearings. I wanted Brembo brake discs, but I could not find them at a price that I was willing to pay. So I went with Febi Bilstein discs. And then I'm not even sure if I actually need these, but the part numbers are different for Polos, so I just went ahead and bought them. And I'd rather be safe than sorry rather than having to wait on parts. And these were only like 10 bucks a piece on eBay. So, you know, if I didn't need them and I spent 20 bucks, too bad. I spent 20 bucks. Not a big deal. The other part of this, though, is, well, actually, let me take this wheel off and then I'll tell you what the other part of all this is. So the other part of all this is I'm going to take the rear brakes that are on this car, this disc brake setup, and I'm going to end up putting that on the MK1 Rabbit pickup truck because I personally hate drum brakes. I think they suck and I don't enjoy working on them. I'd much rather have discs with pads and, you know, what I consider normal because I didn't grow up around old cars. So that was the other part of ordering those dust shields, is I'm just going to take this whole assembly minus the caliper and the caliper carrier because I'm obviously going to be reusing those. But I'm going to take all of this and put it onto that truck. So that's why I went through buying some extra parts. But yeah, now what we need to do is obviously get all that stuff off of the Mark II, and then we can start installing all of this. And hopefully at the end of this, my center caps fit. And at the end of this video, I'll tell you guys how much I spent trying to get center caps to fit on this set of wheels. Got to do whatever you got to do to get the looks. Disassembling the rear stub axles on these cars are pretty simple. If you've ever replaced brake pads and rotors on these cars, it's basically the same process and then just 4 extra bolts at the end. So to start out, you'll need an 8mm Allen head socket or Allen key to break the bolts loose that hold the caliper carrier to the stub axle. If you don't have enough room on your vehicle, you could take the caliper off of the caliper carrier as well, but I didn't want to take more apart than what I had to. I was hoping to not have to take the e-brake cable off either, but wasn't lucky enough to do that. So I popped that off and then just zip tied the caliper up to the coilover to keep it out of the way. This also kept the caliper from just hanging freely from the brake line, as that's not a good idea to do that. Then we needed to pop the grease cap off with a hammer and a chisel, and that exposes the cotter pin and castle nut that holds the entire rotor and wheel bearing assembly on. I just straightened out that cotter pin with pliers and then pulled it out. And then the castle nut should just be able to be spun off by hand if you've installed your wheel bearings properly. Also, be warned, grease is going to be coated on everything from this point on, so have some shop rags or paper towels nearby to clean stuff off as you pull it. With the nut removed, you should be able to pull the brake disc off, and in my case, it pulled all of the bearings and bearing races with it, which was super convenient. Because I'm going to be reusing this stuff in the future on the MK1 pickup truck, I wanted to keep it clean and free of too much dirt and debris, so I set it aside gently and moved on to removing the stub axle and the dust shield. This is just removing 4 bolts, which should require a 15mm socket. Zip those off pretty quick with the impact, and then I stacked the brake disc back on top of it so all of the parts were back together as if they were assembled on the car. That way I don't lose anything with these sitting around in my garage. So while I had the stub axle out of the car and all disassembled, I decided to try something that I've prototyped a while ago just to make sure that it fit. So this is the prototype for making drop plates, which this is a way to lower these cars. Usually it's used for like the MK1 Rabbit pickup trucks because they have a leaf spring rear end instead of the coilover rear end like this MK2 does. But they basically share similar rear axle designs. So I double checked it on this. Got to make a few changes, but overall I'm really happy with how this turned out. And my plan is I'm going to make these for my MK1 and then keep making them after that if anybody wants them. But I'm planning on cutting these out of stainless steel That way it has some corrosion protection, and yeah. So super pumped that those fit. So now let's get back to actually reassembling this car, how it's supposed to go back together. Of course, to get back to being able to put parts on the car, I need to take off the prototype drop plate setup, which is easy. I didn't want to use power tools on this though, as I didn't want to risk cracking the 3D printed plastic. Then, before assembling, I noticed that the threads on the rear beam were pretty crusty, and I thought I should run a tap through them just to clean out all the rust and crud. These are M10 by 1.5 threads, and I just sprayed some WD-40 in the holes before running the tap through it to give it a little bit of lubrication. I really didn't want to freeze a tap in these holes, or worse, bugger up some threads and have to helicoil or replace the entire thing. After cleaning out all the holes, we are ready to start assembling this car again. First challenge though is figuring out which way the dust shields are supposed to go. If they're supposed to be sandwiched between the stub axle and the rear beam, or if they're supposed to go over top of the stub axle and just like get bolted over the front of it. I was too lazy to walk in the house and consult the Bentley manual, so instead I just walked over to compare to the Mark IV that's sitting on the other side of the garage. From that, I figured out that the dust shield is supposed to go over top of the stub axle, so it's closer to the brake disc. Then it's just bolting that back up and torquing it down. The torque for those 4 bolts is 60 Newton meters or 44 foot-pounds. Now we move on to putting the wheel bearing onto the stub axle. Rather than tightening everything down and finding out that I had an issue with how all these parts stacked up, I decided to loose install everything and make sure it lined up before torquing anything. I'm combining a lot of different vehicles parts together here, from Mark IIs to Mark IVs to Polos, so I'm really not 100% sure that these parts are going to work together yet, so I didn't want to do anything that was absolutely permanent and screw up any parts and have to replace them. So then I moved on to putting the brake disc on, which I unfortunately forgot to order a new rotor set screw, so stole that from the Mark IV, and now we have to put the brake caliper back on. I almost forgot to pop the e-brake cable back in, which is a lot easier when the caliper isn't bolted down. And then I went to reuse the same fasteners that I took out, and that's when I realized I had yet another issue. These new stub axles have a taller boss that the bolt goes through, so the old fasteners were actually too short. The fasteners that are correct for the Polo parts are about 10 millimeters longer to account for this, which, as you may have guessed, matches the bolts that are on the Mark IV. So I robbed some more parts from that car for the sake of being able to complete this install, and we got the caliper mounted up, and now it's time to go back and torque everything down. Seems that the parts all lined up properly. So I start out with the wheel bearing torque, which I had to do some research online to find the spec for it, because obviously we don't have Polos in the US. Of course, when you search online, you find a lot of conflicting information. So I ended up just referring to the Mark IV Bentley manual anyways, as it's essentially the same design, and I use that spec. So that torque is 175 Newton meters or 129 foot-pounds. I purposely left the dust cap off so I could retorque this joint when I put the car back on the ground. That way I knew it was tight with the suspension loaded. Then I moved on to torquing the 2 brake caliper fasteners, which get torqued to 65 Newton meters or 48 foot-pounds. This was difficult to do because I couldn't fit my good Craftsman torque wrench into such a tight area, but I managed to get it in for one of those bolts and couldn't fit it for the other, so I'm trusting my life to a Harbor Freight torque wrench for one of those bolts. But that wraps up assembling these parts, and now it's time to see if these center caps will fit. So, a few snafus that I ran into doing this. One, I did not have a brake rotor set screw, so I went and stole that off of the Mark IV that is just sitting over there, because why not? That's the beauty of having cars that use the same parts. The other thing that I ran into is the brake caliper bracket bolts, which you probably can't see because it's dark back here. Those those are different lengths. These are the ones that came out. They're like 7/8 of an inch, whatever that works out to. I think that's 20 millimeters or something. And the stub axles for this setup have a like taller boss to them. So those bolts didn't even stick out the backside. So yet again, I stole bolts off the Mark IV. So I'll have to order bolts to replace that, and also for when I do the other side, because I've only touched this side of this car. I have not done the driver's side of it. So yeah, not too bad. I'm also leaving the dust cap off on purpose because I will retorque this when the car is sitting on the ground and the suspension is loaded, because I'm pretty sure that's how you're supposed to do those. I did torque it already, unload it, but you're supposed to torque it when it's loaded, so I'll just do that. And the other thing too is I guessed on the torque spec because we don't have Polos in the US, so I have no references to look up. I tried Googling, and of course you get 5 different answers, so I just went with the Mark IV torque spec, because that's what I had to go off of, and it's basically the same design. So hopefully that's right. If it's not, I guess I'll replace wheel bearings when they burn up, but it is what it is. So now what we get to do is put that on there and make sure that this fits. Fingers crossed, because I don't want to do more work to get these center caps to fit. Let's find out. So the center caps fit. I am pumped about this because I've had these wheels for 1.5 to 2 years now and have not been able to see them on the car with the center caps on the entire side. So I am absolutely pumped about this. And they look awesome. So I still got to put the dust cap in. I tightened that one a little bit too much. Oh, there we go. So I still need to put the dust cap in there, but just quick glance, I'm pretty sure it's still going to fit. If it doesn't fit when the dust cap is in there, I'll run them without dust caps, because these are sealed bearings, so I trust it a little bit more to survive without the dust cap there versus that design. So yeah, I did do the math of how much I spent on all of this stuff, and if you include the MG line center caps, the BBS, the new BBS caps, and then all of these parts, the stub axle, rotors, bearings, new dust shields, it comes out to a grand total of $955. All of that just to make things look pretty. So could I have spent that more effectively? Probably. But it is what it is. That cost also doesn't count the powder coating for these wheels, or the lips, or the set of center caps that I bought that I didn't end up using. So yeah, it's a lot of money. Cars are expensive. I have very expensive hobbies. But regardless, that's not what we're here to talk about today. That is going to wrap up this video. I have a bunch of stuff to clean up now that I've just left in total disarray. So yeah, gonna clean up. I still got to do the other side as well because I only did the passenger side to show you guys. So I'm going to order the proper bolts. That way I don't have to keep stealing them from the Mark IV. And then I'll go back and do the other side. But for now, that's going to wrap this up. So hope you've enjoyed this one. Hope you've learned a bit about wheel bearing upgrades for Mark IIs. If you weren't aware that, you could do this. Yeah. Thanks for watching. Thanks for subscribing. And we'll see everybody next time.